The morning sky over New Seattle was the color of rust. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the Global Governance Tower, watching the sun rise behind layers of atmospheric haze that had become permanent fixtures of Earth's weather. It was 2247, and the planet was dying, not slowly anymore, but in convulsions that shook governments and shattered hope. Behind her, the emergency council chambers hummed with urgent conversation. World leaders, scientists, military generals, and corporate titans had gathered for what would become the most important meeting in human history, though most didn't know it yet. Sarah had called them here with a single message: "We have 72 hours to make a choice that will define our species for the next 1,000 years." The data sheet compiled told a story of collapse. Coastal cities were already being swallowed by rising oceans. The Amazon rainforest, what remained of it, had transformed from a carbon sink into a carbon source, accelerating climate feedback loops beyond any recovery point. Aquifers were dry. Soil was depleted. Fisheries had crashed decades ago. Agricultural zones that once fed billions could now barely sustain millions. Wars over water and arable land had already claimed 200 million lives in the last decade alone. Sarah was 48, with silver streaking through her black hair, and she'd spent the last 15 years running the Exodus Initiative, a classified project that most governments didn't officially acknowledge. But privately, every nation that mattered had contributed funding, resources, and expertise. Because deep down, every world leader understood the truth. Earth was finished. The presentation began in silence. Sarah clicked through holographic displays that showed Earth's trajectory. Not a projection. Not a model. Real data. Real measurements. The Great Filter, a term borrowed from theoretical physics, had stopped being theoretical. It was here now, and it was closing. "We have a window," Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of finality. Not months. Not years. A window of approximately 8 to 15 years before cascade failures make our planet uninhabitable. We're already seeing it. The migration of billions is creating conflicts that destabilize every nation. The climate refugees are triggering wars. The wars are triggering famines. The famines are triggering social collapse. And once social collapse accelerates, we lose the infrastructure, the knowledge, the unity necessary to do what must be done. Prime Minister James Morrison of the United Earth Coalition leaned forward. He was a tall man with the bearing of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions before, but his hands were shaking slightly. "How many?" he asked quietly. "How many what?" Sarah replied, though she knew exactly what he meant. "How many people can we save? If we do this, how many leave Earth?" Sarah took a breath. This was the moment that would define everything. All of them. Or at least, we try. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the machines seemed to pause. "That's insane," General Liu Chen from the Asian Coalition said flatly. "We can't evacuate 8 billion people. The logistics alone, the resources, the ships, the fuel, the medical supplies, the food, are exactly why we can't do it with conventional methods," Sarah interrupted. She clicked to the next display, and a rotating three-dimensional model appeared above the table. It showed something that looked like a massive crystalline structure made of smaller repeating units. "This is the warp-weave engine, or at least the theoretical model we've been developing for the past 12 years. The room erupted with questions, but Sarah continued. "We've known for decades that FTL travel, faster than light travel, was theoretically possible. The math works. Einstein's equations allow for it under specific conditions. But it required energy outputs we thought were impossible to generate. Until we stopped thinking about it as a problem to be solved and started thinking about it as a problem to be distributed." She displayed blueprints now, showing how the revolutionary engine worked. Instead of one massive power core, the warp-weave distributed the burden across a network of smaller fusion reactors, each one manageable, each one something that could be manufactured at scale. The genius wasn't in the core concept, it was in making it producible. "How many ships?" Morrison asked, his political mind already calculating. 1 million, Sarah said. "Exactly 1 million. We've run the models 1,000 times. 1 million modular colony vessels, each capable of carrying 5,000 to 8,000 people, each equipped with its own warp-weave engine, each self-sustaining for the journey and capable of initiating planetary settlement independently. 5 million times 1 million, Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the Japanese Science Council whispered. That's 8 billion people. Possibly more, if we push the capacity. Yes, Sarah confirmed. We can save everyone. But only if we do this together, and only if we do it now. The generals and politicians exchanged looks. Some were skeptical. Some were afraid. But Sarah could see it in their eyes. They understood. This wasn't a question of whether it was possible anymore. The question was whether they had the will to make it happen. The resources required, Admiral Hassan from the African Union said, her voice careful. The raw materials, the energy, the workforce. Where does it come from? Sarah had anticipated this. She clicked to a new display showing orbital infrastructure. We've already begun. Over the last decade, under the guise of commercial space development, we've positioned asteroid mining operations throughout the inner solar system. We have 17 orbital manufacturing facilities already in operation, built inside hollowed asteroids. We have fusion reactors powering everything. We have the infrastructure. What we've lacked is permission and unity. You've been preparing this without telling us, Morrison said, and it wasn't a question. I've been preparing this hoping we'd never need to tell you, Sarah replied. Because if I'd announced a 1,000,000-ship Exodus program, every government would have started jockeying for position, hoarding resources, trying to ensure their own people got spots. We'd have descended into chaos. Instead, we prepared quietly. And now, the preparation is complete. What remains is the decision. The debate raged through the night. Some argued for trying to fix Earth instead. Others questioned whether humanity even deserved to survive if it had destroyed its own world. A few representatives from smaller nations worried about being left behind. But gradually, through exhaustion and logic and the simple force of necessity, consensus emerged. By dawn, it was decided. The Exodus would launch. Sarah stood alone again at the observation deck as the first real rays of sun broke through the haze. Somewhere out there, across the solar system, people were already receiving the news. Ships were beginning their pre-launch preparations. The logistics of the most ambitious project in human history were already spinning into motion. She thought about her sister, who was already assigned to ship 7423, bound for a system 42 light-years away. She thought about the billions of people who would never see Earth again, who would be born in the void or on distant worlds that were still just points of light in the sky. And she thought about the Great Filter, that invisible barrier that separated extinct species from those that survived to explore the cosmos. For the first time in recorded history, humanity had seen it coming. And against all odds, all logistics, all reasonable expectations, they were going to do the impossible. They were going to fly. 6 months later, the solar system had transformed into something that no human had ever witnessed. The orbital facilities that Sarah had kept classified were now the center of a global mobilization that made World War II look like a regional conflict. Millions of workers, engineers, construction crews, medical personnel, pilots, scientists, and countless others were now distributed across hundreds of platforms, facilities, and construction sites throughout Earth orbit and beyond. The warp-weave engine production had become humanity's singular focus. Every fusion reactor on Earth that could be safely spared from planetary infrastructure had been repurposed to power the manufacturing process. Solar panels the size of cities collected energy in space. Asteroid material was being processed at a rate of thousands of tons per hour, shaped into components that would eventually become the cores of the engines themselves. Commander David Foster stood in the central control hub of Orbital Station Prime, watching the real-time telemetry of Ship No. 1 as its final systems came online. He was 52, a career aerospace officer from the United States who'd been selected to oversee the actual logistics of the Exodus. It was a position that carried more responsibility than any person had ever held. Engine diagnostics complete, reported Chen, one of his lead technicians, her voice crackling through the communication system. Warp-weave array is showing nominal readings across all distributed units. She's ready for power-up. David nodded, even though Chen was in a different orbital facility several thousand kilometers away. The communication lag was only a few seconds, one of the small miracles of their expanded infrastructure. "Begin the sequence," he ordered. What followed was the first live test of a warp-weave engine at full capacity outside of simulations. The massive colony ship, a vessel nearly 3 kilometers long, began to hum with power. Its distributed reactor network, which had been carefully calibrated over months of preparation, synchronized in a cascade of controlled fusion reactions. The space around the ship began to shimmer. It wasn't a dramatic effect. There was no explosion, no brilliant flash, no science fiction special effects. Instead, there was a subtle distortion in the fabric of space itself, visible only to the extremely sensitive instruments monitoring every aspect of the event. The warp weave wasn't creating a wormhole or tearing space-time apart. It was doing something far more elegant. It was creating a localized bubble where the laws of physics operated slightly differently, where relativistic effects were dampened, and the traditional speed of light limit became merely a suggestion. "Velocity increasing," Chen reported, her voice tight with controlled excitement. 5% of light speed. 15%. 30%. "She's moving, David. She's actually moving faster than light relative to external reference frames. We're seeing relativistic effects, but they're being negated by the field configuration. It's working." David felt his heart pounding. They'd run the calculations 10,000 times. They'd run the simulations for years. But seeing it actually happen, seeing Ship 1 accelerate to a velocity that should have been impossible, was something else entirely. "Hold steady," David commanded. "Maintain for 30 seconds." The ship held. The warp weave hummed silently in the void. And for 30 seconds, humanity possessed technology that every established civilization in the galaxy said was impossible. When they powered down the engine, Ship 1 decelerated smoothly back to conventional speeds. The test was complete. Within hours, the news had spread across every communication channel on Earth and the orbital facilities. The exodus was possible. The first ship worked. The production lines accelerated. What followed over the next 18 months was an industrial mobilization unlike anything in human history. The question was no longer, can we do this? But how fast can we do it? Ships began to roll off the line at an increasing pace. The second and third ships launched within weeks of Ship 1. Then there were 10 ships in various stages of completion. Then 50. Then 100. The challenges came from unexpected directions. Manufacturing 1 million ships meant standardizing designs in ways that created psychological resistance among some groups. Different nations wanted their ships to carry their own people, leading to complex negotiations about resource allocation and population distribution. Religious groups debated whether the Exodus violated theological principles. Philosophers questioned whether humanity was running away from its problems rather than solving them. But through it all, the ships kept being built. Sarah had assumed direct oversight of the settlement protocols, working with specialists from dozens of nations to create the systems that would sustain the Exodus. Each ship needed not just physical supplies but social structures, governance models, scientific knowledge archives, cultural heritage records, and educational systems that could function across generations. Some of the colony ships would arrive at their destinations after 70 years in transit. The children born on those ships would be in their 70s when they landed. The systems had to be designed to maintain humanity across that vast span. Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief architect of the colony protocols, was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd spent the last decade thinking about how to build sustainable societies. He'd worked with Sarah to create what they called the distributed civilization model, a framework that recognized that the million ships wouldn't function as a single unified government, but as a network of semi-autonomous communities, each with its own governance structure but all connected by communication networks and shared resources. "The key," Marcus explained to Sarah during one of their weekly planning sessions, "is recognizing that we're not just evacuating Earth. We're seeding a new form of human civilization. These ships won't be temporary. They'll be permanent habitats. Some will establish planetary colonies and then disperse. Others might remain in space permanently. We need to build systems that can handle that flexibility. Sarah reviewed the educational curricula that would be loaded onto each ship. Every child born during the Exodus would learn not just traditional subjects, but also the skills necessary for ship maintenance, planetary settlement, and interstellar navigation. The knowledge archives contain not just technical specifications, but the entire recorded history of human culture, art, music, literature, philosophy, science. If Earth itself was lost, at least humanity's accomplishments would survive across the million ships scattered throughout the galaxy. Meanwhile, the political complications were multiplying. The United Earth Coalition, the primary governing body that had managed the Exodus preparation, was being tested by internal divisions. Some nations wanted priority in the launch sequence. Others worried that they wouldn't receive sufficient resources or technological access. The African Union demanded equal representation in the oversight councils. The Asian coalition pushed for expanded ship capacity. Every nation wanted assurance that its people would be protected, its culture preserved, its interests secured. Through it all, David Foster managed the logistics with meticulous precision. Ships were categorized by destination. The closest star systems received the earliest launches because their travel times were shortest. The more distant destinations, some requiring journeys of 50, 70, even 100 years, launched later, with larger populations and more extensive resource supplies. Mining colonies, scientific research vessels, agricultural ships with specialized hydroponic systems, medical facilities designed to function as mobile hospitals. Each type of vessel was carefully positioned in the overall Exodus strategy. By the time Ship 500 had been launched, the operation had become routine. Engineers barely celebrated anymore. The ships that had seemed so miraculous in their newness now felt almost mundane. Another ship launched. Another 5,000 people left Earth for the stars. Another community began its journey into the void. But the real test came when the first alien contact occurred. The signal came from the direction of the Tau Ceti system, picked up by one of the deep space monitoring stations that had been established specifically to detect external communication. The message was clear, unmistakable, and deeply concerning. Unidentified species. Your activities have been detected. Your mass expansion into interstellar space is noted. Explain your purpose and request permission to proceed. It was signed, the Silent Council of Established Interests. Sarah received the message in the middle of a staff meeting. The color drained from her face as she read the translation. She'd known, theoretically, that humanity would eventually encounter other civilizations. But she'd hoped they'd have more time. They were still in the early stages of the Exodus. Only 70 ships had been launched. Only 350,000 people were in transit toward the stars. Get me every available expert, Sarah said quietly. We need to respond carefully. The entire Exodus depends on how we handle this first contact. The signal from the Silent Council had been, in diplomatic terms, a warning. In practical terms, it was something far more ominous, a threat. The established galactic civilization, a loose association of mature alien species that had been exploring and settling the galaxy for hundreds of thousands of years, did not look kindly on newcomers who arrived with what appeared to be a coordinated colonization strategy. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been humanity's lead xenopsychologist for the past 8 years, specializing in the theoretical behavior of advanced alien species. When Sarah called her to the emergency council, Elena had spent exactly 4 minutes reading the message before her conclusion was blunt. They're scared. Scared, Sarah repeated. They're an advanced civilization. They have technology we can barely comprehend. What would they be scared of? Elena pulled up a holographic display showing the spatial distribution of known alien settlements throughout the galaxy. Because of this, look at the pattern. The established civilizations, and we count at least 17 major species in the Silent Council, plus dozens of minor ones. They've spent millions of years gradually expanding through space. They negotiate territorial boundaries. They respect each other's spheres of influence. They've built a stable, predictable system. She pointed to where humanity's exodus trajectory was displayed. And then suddenly, a species that's been in its home system for its entire history, less than 1 million years of spacefaring technology, a fraction of what the oldest civilizations possess, launches 1,000,000 ships simultaneously. That's not expansion. That's invasion. The council sat in stunned silence. "We should have known this would happen," Commander Foster said, his voice tense. "We should have sent diplomatic vessels first. Explained our situation. Asked permission." "With what?" Sarah responded. "We didn't have diplomatic experience with alien species. We had a single shot at exodus before our planet became uninhabitable. We couldn't afford to wait for negotiation. And now we're committed. 170 ships are already in flight. Another 250 are in pre-launch sequences. We can't stop this." "Then we negotiate," Elena said firmly. "And we negotiate from a position of what we actually are, not invaders but refugees. We explain that Earth is dying. We explain that this isn't an attempt to conquer galactic territory, but an attempt to survive. We appeal to whatever sense of compassion or pragmatism the Silent Council might possess." The response they prepared took 3 days to craft. Every word was considered, every phrase weighed for cultural implications they could barely predict. The message was sent to every coordinate where the Silent Council was known to have influence, broadcast on frequencies that the established civilizations were known to monitor. To the Silent Council of Established Interests, we are humanity, a young species from the world of Earth. Our planet has become uninhabitable due to self-inflicted environmental damage. We possess no resources to sustain our expanding population on a single world. Our exodus is not an act of conquest, but an act of survival. We request peaceful passage through interstellar space and the opportunity to establish settlements on worlds that are currently uninhabited or minimally populated. We seek not dominion but refuge. We ask that your wisdom and longevity be applied to our desperate circumstance." The response came 47 hours later. It was, diplomatically speaking, a disaster. "Your expansion is noted and deemed premature. Humanity has demonstrated insufficient maturity in managing your single world. Your rapid militarization of space technology and mass exodus suggests aggressive intent. The Silent Council imposes an immediate quarantine zone. No human vessels will be permitted to cross into the sectors designated as Council territory. Violation of this boundary will result in immediate military intervention. You have been warned." A map accompanied the message. The territory reserved for the Silent Council was vast, encompassing roughly 40% of the galaxy's spiral arm where most habitable systems were located. Human exodus trajectories that had been planned to reach some of the galaxy's most promising settlement worlds were now redirected. The ships that had already been launched on those courses would need to be rerouted or informed of the new restrictions. Sarah felt a moment of absolute despair. They'd risked everything to launch this exodus, and now they were being told they could only settle in the least desirable regions of the galaxy. It was a humiliation that felt like a death sentence. But then Elena smiled. "They're not attacking," Elena said. "They're not destroying the ships. They're not trying to prevent the exodus. They're imposing restrictions, yes, but they're doing it through negotiation, not force. That means they can be negotiated with further." She pulled up the territorial map and began analyzing it carefully. "Look at this. The quarantine zone excludes the outer regions of the spiral arm. It also excludes some of the galactic core territory, where most established civilizations are concentrated. But these regions here, these outer zones and the peripheral systems, these are technically available to us. They're not as resource-rich as the core systems, but they're habitable. Some of them are already showing signs of previous colonization attempts that failed. Essentially, the Silent Council is saying, you can have the scraps, but not the feast." "That's not much of a negotiating position," General Liu said bitterly. "No," Elena agreed. "But it's an opening. And right now, we need openings more than we need victories." Sarah authorized a series of diplomatic probes to be sent towards several of the established civilizations individually. If the Silent Council was unified by common interest, then individual species might have individual concerns. Some might be more sympathetic to humanity's plight. Some might see opportunity in a young, ambitious species that could serve as a buffer against their own rivals. The responses came in slowly, over weeks and months. The Kaer, a long-lived species that had been exploring space for over 2 million years, expressed mild concern about human survival but had no interest in assisting. The Zen, a hive-mind collective species, found the entire concept of individual human survival baffling and irrelevant. The Vex, a merchant culture that had built their civilization on trade, saw immediate commercial potential in humanity and began proposing economic arrangements that were simultaneously helpful and devastatingly exploitative. And then there was contact with the Tall. The Tall were relatively young by galactic standards. They'd only been spacefaring for about 80,000 years, a mere infant compared to civilizations that had been traveling among the stars for millions. They'd experienced their own near-extinction event about 30,000 years ago, an asteroid impact that had destroyed their native world's biosphere. They'd survived only because they'd already developed space habitats and off-world colonies. They understood on a deep level what it meant to lose a world. Their response to humanity's situation was unexpected. "We recognize your struggle. We comprehend the urgency of your exodus. The Silent Council's restrictions are unjust, but they are also inevitable. Such is the nature of established power. We cannot challenge them directly, but we can offer assistance in ways that do not violate the quarantine zone. We propose trade agreements for certain restricted technologies and the sharing of information regarding habitable systems in the outer territories. We also propose a formal mutual defense pact between our species. Perhaps together, humanity and the Tall can create sufficient alternative influence to eventually shift the Council's position." It was the first real alliance humanity had formed outside their own species. It was also the first indication that the galactic political landscape was far more complex and negotiable than the Silent Council's ultimatum had suggested. Sarah authorized the trade agreements and began implementing the Tall's suggestions for outer territory settlement. The exodus would continue, but now it would be guided by both human knowledge and Tall expertise. Ships were rerouted to newly recommended systems. Alternative navigation paths were calculated that avoided the most heavily monitored quarantine boundaries. The political reality of the situation began to stabilize into a new equilibrium. Humanity wouldn't be getting the choicest settlement worlds, but they also wouldn't be completely frozen out of galactic expansion. They would be relegated to the role of frontier settlers, pushing into the galaxy's margins, making homes in less desirable territory. But they would be pushing outward. And that was what mattered. 22 months into the exodus, ship number 847 completed its voyage to Kepler 442b, a terrestrial world orbiting in the habitable zone of a K-class star 47 light-years from Earth. The ship's captain, Commander Thomas Bradley, had spent the last 70 years of transit time managing a population of 6,500 people across multiple generations. The children born during the voyage were now adults. The elderly, who'd left Earth, had passed away. The ship itself had become a world unto itself, a small floating ecosystem that had somehow sustained life across the vast emptiness of space. As the ship's sensors scanned the target world, Thomas felt a sense of completion that he'd been carrying his entire adult life finally beginning to release. The atmosphere was breathable. The water was drinkable. The radiation levels were within acceptable parameters. The gravity was only slightly different from Earth's. It was, by any reasonable measure, a habitable world. Thomas initiated the planetary descent sequence. The first teams to land were the agricultural specialists, who immediately began setting up the hydroponic facilities that had been carefully designed and built aboard the ship during the 70-year transit. The medical teams established the colonial hospital. The engineers began construction of the first permanent settlement structures using the advanced three-dimensional printing technology that had been part of the ship's manufacturing systems. Within 48 hours of landing, the colony of Kepler 442b was officially established. Back in the solar system, Mission Control received the news through a delay of more than 47 years of light travel time. The message, transmitted across the vast emptiness of space, reached Earth with signals that had been bouncing through relay stations and space buoys for nearly 5 decades. Kepler 442b is habitable. Population 6,500. Beginning permanent settlement. Repeat, Expedition successful. Sarah Chen, now 70 years old and officially retired but still consulting on Exodus logistics, received the news with quiet satisfaction. She was sitting in her small apartment in what remained of Seattle. The city had been partially evacuated but not abandoned, as some had chosen to remain on Earth despite the deteriorating conditions. The irony was that the massive resource investment in the Exodus had actually increased Earth's productive capacity. With most of the surface dedicated to minimal agricultural support, and with the expanded automated systems that had been developed for space manufacturing, Earth was actually becoming more sustainable, just with a much smaller population. The first successful settlement was followed by others. Ships 932, 981, and 1,004 all reported successful landings over the following years. The network of human colonial worlds began to expand. Each settlement sent back data that informed the next expeditions. Knowledge about which agricultural systems worked best, which building materials were most suitable, which social structures created the most stable communities. All of this information was transmitted back through the vast stretches of space to guide the thousands of remaining ships still in transit. The Exodus had become a reality. It had moved from being an impossible dream to being a systematic, ongoing process that was as normal as breathing to the people managing it. But not everyone had chosen to leave Earth. Dr. Michael Torres was one of Earth's remaining senior scientists, and he'd made the conscious decision not to participate in the Exodus. Instead, he joined a group of researchers and philosophers who were working to preserve Earth itself, not to restore it to its pristine pre-industrial state, which was impossible, but to stabilize it at a sustainable level that could support the limited human population that had chosen to remain. Michael had spent the last 20 years working on ecosystem restoration projects. Large areas of the planet that had been converted to agricultural use were being allowed to revert to wild systems. The Sahara, which had been expanding for a century, was being stabilized through a combination of massive irrigation projects and aggressive reforestation. The oceans, though damaged, were beginning to show signs of recovery as fishing pressure had been removed by the Exodus. Earth would never again be the world it had been. The climate had shifted permanently. Species that had gone extinct would remain extinct. But it could be sustainable. It could be habitable. And for Michael, that was enough. The remaining human population on Earth, approximately 200 million people who'd chosen to stay for various reasons, had begun to develop a new relationship with their world. There was no longer the sense of impending collapse that had characterized the decades before the Exodus. Instead, there was a sense of purpose, of building something new. The remaining cities were being redesigned around principles of sustainability. New agricultural technologies were being developed. The humans who'd stayed behind were creating a society based on the lessons learned from the Exodus's near-extinction level crisis. In the outer territories of the galaxy, where the human exodus was dispersing, a different kind of society was emerging. Dr. Amara Okonkwo was a sociologist who'd traveled aboard ship number 1,000,001, the final ship in the originally planned Exodus. Unlike the earlier ships, which had carried primarily first-generation Earth evacuees, this final wave of vessels carried people who had been born in space habitats. They'd never set foot on Earth. The planet was to them a historical artifact, something they knew from records and cultural memories, but not from lived experience. These new generation humans were different. They'd been born in microgravity. They'd grown up in structured, artificial environments. They thought differently about community and space. And when they arrived at their destination worlds, they brought a perspective that was neither fully Earth-human nor fully alien, but something in between. The settlement that grew from Amara's ship on the world they named New Harmony became a test case for what the human settlements could become when they were built by people with no nostalgic attachment to Earth's old ways. The architecture was designed around principles of efficiency and beauty that derived from space habitat construction rather than Earth-based traditions. The social structures were more fluid, less hierarchical. The cultural practices developed new traditions that blended human heritage with the practical necessities of frontier settlement. And they worked. Not perfectly, no human society ever did, but they worked well enough that ships arriving later began studying New Harmony's models and applying them to their own settlements. Across thousands of worlds scattered throughout the galaxy's outer territories, human civilization was adapting and evolving. Ships that had expected to settle on planetary surfaces instead established orbital habitats. Communities that had planned to remain isolated instead formed trading networks with each other and with the sympathetic alien species like the Tall. The distributed civilization model that Marcus Webb had designed proved to be remarkably flexible, allowing each settlement to develop its own character while maintaining connection to the broader human network. The Tall, working in cooperation with human diplomatic missions, began to quietly challenge the Silent Council's quarantine restrictions. Not through direct confrontation, neither the Tall nor humanity were militarily strong enough to challenge the established powers, but through persistent, incremental expansion into gray zones of territory that weren't explicitly forbidden. They established trade posts. They created resource-sharing agreements. They slowly built a presence that made the quarantine zone harder to enforce. 10 years into the Exodus, humanity had established 3,000 colonies across 200 star systems. 20 years in, that number had grown to 15,000 settlements across 600 systems. The population distributed across the million ships and their target worlds had grown, through births and arrivals, to nearly 8 billion humans, essentially Earth's pre-Exodus population, but now scattered across an area of space light-years in extent. The Great Filter, which had seemed like an impassable barrier when humanity had stood alone on a dying Earth, had become just another obstacle to overcome. The species that had once seemed insignificant, primitive, doomed to extinction, had become a force in galactic affairs. Not the strongest force, the established civilizations still far outmatched humanity in technology and resources. But a force nonetheless, present, expanding, growing, learning. Sarah Chen, watching the reports from her retirement home, felt something like peace for the first time in decades. The Exodus had worked. Against all odds, against all the skepticism of galactic experts and established civilizations, humanity had survived. More than that, humanity had thrived. But the greatest challenges, she knew, were still ahead. 40 years into the Exodus, the human civilization had reached a point of complexity that nobody had quite anticipated. With millions of people spread across thousands of worlds and habitats, with thousands of independent communities each making their own decisions about governance, culture, and development, the question of how to maintain human civilization as a unified concept became increasingly pressing. Dr. Marcus Webb, now in his 90s but still actively involved in managing the distributed civilization model, had proposed a solution: the consensus network. The basic concept was elegant. As communication technology improved and humanity's engineers, inspired by both human and Tall innovations, had made remarkable progress in developing faster quantum entanglement-based communication systems, it became possible to create a network where millions of people could participate in discussions about matters that affected all of them. Not a central government imposing decisions from above, but a genuine consensus-building mechanism where each community could voice its perspective and contribute to collective decisions. The first test of the consensus network came when humanity needed to decide how to respond to a new challenge: the discovery of archaeological sites on several of the previously uninhabited worlds where humans had been settling. The sites suggested that these worlds had hosted previous civilizations, long extinct, but possessed artifacts and knowledge that could be valuable. Some communities wanted to preserve the sites as historical monuments and study them carefully, following protocols that had been established in Earth's museums centuries ago. Other communities argued that the resources involved in preservation could be better used for expanding their own settlements. A few colonies wanted to harvest the sites for any technology or knowledge that might be immediately useful. Instead of letting this become a source of conflict between different human settlements, the consensus network was activated. Over a period of 30 days, representatives from settlements across the human diaspora participated in structured discussions about what should be done. The network allowed for real-time dialogue, shared analysis of data, and collaborative problem-solving. The eventual consensus was surprisingly nuanced. The archaeological sites would be preserved and studied, but the research would be conducted by teams drawn from multiple settlements, with the knowledge shared across the entire human civilization. Resources would be allocated fairly, with more advanced settlements providing funding and technical expertise while frontier settlements provided personnel and practical support. What happened next was unexpected. The process of building consensus created bonds between previously isolated communities. Settlements that had been focused entirely on their own survival began to feel part of something larger. A planetary colony on Kepler 442b formed a research partnership with an orbital habitat around Tau Ceti. Communities in different star systems began trading not just resources but cultural works, music, art, literature created by humans and adapted by humans from Tal and other alien sources. Humanity was developing a distributed consciousness, not a hive mind like the Zen possessed, but a networked awareness where billions of individuals could maintain autonomy while being part of a connected whole. The Silent Council, watching this development, became concerned. A new message arrived from the established civilizations: the accelerating integration of human civilization and your expansion into previously marginal territories is noted. While your species has respected the quarantine boundaries, your growing influence on younger civilizations like the Tal represents a shifting power balance. The Silent Council formally proposes that humanity accept a status as a restricted development species. Your settlements will be permitted to exist, but will be forbidden from expansion beyond your current territory for a period of 5,000 years to allow for adequate cultural and technological maturation. It was, in diplomatic terms, a proposal that sounded reasonable but carried an implicit threat. Humanity could exist, but in a frozen state. No growth, no expansion, no possibility of reaching toward the galactic core, where the richest resources and most habitable systems were located. The response from the Human Consensus Network was immediate and, surprisingly, unanimous. We respectfully decline. Human civilization has demonstrated remarkable capacity for growth, adaptation, and cooperation with other species. To artificially restrict our development would be to treat us as children unable to govern ourselves. We will continue to expand peacefully, to respect the territorial and cultural boundaries of established civilizations, and to build networks of mutual cooperation with like-minded species. We ask that the Silent Council trust in humanity's continued development rather than constraining it. It was the first time that humanity had directly defied the Silent Council's wishes. It was also strategically a calculatrisk. The human civilization still didn't possess the military capability to defend itself against the established powers if they chose to use force. But they had something else: allies, and the backing of a distributed civilization that was unified in its purpose. The Tal responded to humanity's defiance by publicly announcing an expanded alliance. 3 other younger species, the Krell, a technological civilization that had achieved spacefaring status only 30,000 years ago, and the Vermis, a collective consciousness created by a fusion of cybernetic technology and biological intelligence, joined in declaring their support for humanity's right to continue expanding. For several tense months, there was genuine uncertainty about whether the Silent Council would respond militarily. There were reports of military buildups at the quarantine zone boundaries. There were diplomatic incidents when human research vessels strayed too close to restricted space. There were heated exchanges between human negotiators and Silent Council representatives. But gradually, the tension eased. The established civilizations realized that attempting to militarily suppress the human exodus would be far more costly than allowing it to continue. Humanity had become too distributed, too networked, too difficult to kill. Destroying 1 million ships would be possible if the attack came as a coordinated surprise, but humanity had developed sufficient defensive capabilities and distributed decision-making to detect and respond to such an attack. More importantly, the economics of suppression didn't make sense. The Silent Council had built their civilization on trade, on stability, on mutual respect for territorial boundaries. Starting a war that would destabilize the entire galactic economy would hurt them as much as it would hurt humanity. So, instead of war, there came negotiation. The resulting treaty, which came to be known as the Treaty of Open Frontiers, formally expanded human space. The quarantine zone was reduced by 20%. Human settlements were permitted to expand into previously restricted systems. In exchange, Humanity agreed to limit military expansion, to not expand beyond certain clearly defined boundaries for the next 1,000 years, and to submit to a neutral arbitration process if territorial disputes arose. It was, by any measure, a diplomatic victory for humanity. They'd been a species with no galactic presence 4 decades earlier. Now they were negotiating treaties with the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy as equals. And the Exodus continued. 70 years into the Exodus, something unexpected occurred that nobody had fully anticipated. The first generation born in deep space reached adulthood. These children, who'd been born on ships during the long transits between Earth and their destination systems, had grown up in environments fundamentally different from Earth. They'd never experienced natural gravity. They'd never seen an unobstructed sky, or felt rain on their skin, or smelled a forest, or swam in an ocean. Their entire experience of life had been mediated through technology, artificial atmospheres, manufactured food, simulated environments designed to prevent psychological damage from the monotony of space. And many of them didn't want to land on planetary surfaces. Dr. Lisa Zhao had been born aboard ship number 307. She was now 27 years old, and when her ship approached its target settlement world, she made a decision that shocked many of the original mission planners. She requested to remain in space. Not just on the ship itself, but in the orbital stations that had been established in the target system. She'd been trained as an engineer, and she wanted to apply that training to the real work of the distributed civilization, building the infrastructure that allowed humans to thrive in space. Lisa wasn't alone. Of the 12 million humans born in space during the first 70 years of the Exodus, approximately 30% had expressed similar preferences. They wanted to remain in orbital habitats. They wanted to develop further the technology of space living. They wanted to explore the possibility that humans might not need planetary worlds at all. This created a philosophical and practical crisis. The original Exodus plan had assumed that the ships would eventually be emptied, their populations transferred to planetary settlements, and the ships themselves repurposed or decommissioned. But if a significant portion of humanity preferred to remain in space, the entire infrastructure of the Exodus needed to be reconsidered. Marcus Webb, now in his early hundreds and sustained by medical technology that had become available during the Exodus, convened an emergency session of the Distributed Civilizations Governing Councils. "This is actually a good problem to have," he told the assembled representatives. "It means humanity is developing a diverse set of viable life strategies. Some of us will be planetary settlers. Some of us will remain in orbital habitats. Some of us will be deep space explorers. The key is ensuring that all these different pathways can coexist and support each other." The resulting restructuring of the Exodus was profound. Instead of treating ships as temporary vehicles, they were converted into permanent habitats. The vessels that had been designed for a 70-year voyage were retrofitted to last indefinitely. New ships were built that were explicitly designed for permanent space residence, rather than as temporary transports. Advanced mining and manufacturing facilities were established in asteroid belts throughout the human-controlled territories. A new infrastructure emerged, the space cities. These were massive orbital habitats, some of them as large as small planets, constructed from hollowed asteroids and built in modular fashion by human engineers. They served as hubs for trade, research, culture, and community across the scattered human civilization. The first space city, named New Renaissance, was constructed in orbit around Kepler 442b. It became a hub of human culture and science, a place where researchers from 1,000 different settlements could gather, where artists could collaborate, where philosophers could debate the nature of existence while looking out at the stars. Lisa Zhao became one of the chief engineers on the New Renaissance project. She worked alongside tall specialists and engineers from other allied species, designing and building systems that allowed humans to live in space, not as a hardship or temporary measure, but as a genuine way of life. The emergence of the space-dwelling population created a new dynamic in human civilization. The distributed civilization model evolved again, adding a new layer of integration. There were now 3 primary categories of human settlement: planetary colonies, orbital habitats, and deep space explorers. Each group had different needs, different perspectives, and different contributions to make to the broader human civilization. And despite the differences, they maintained connection. The consensus network expanded to include representatives from all three groups. Cultural exchanges happened across space. Young people from planetary settlements would travel to orbital cities for education, then choose where to establish their lives. Some children born in space cities would eventually decide they wanted to live under planetary gravity and would relocate to Earth normal worlds. Humanity was becoming a truly spacefaring species, not just in the sense that they traveled in space, but in the sense that space itself was becoming home. The Silent Council, observing this development, realized that they had fundamentally miscalculated humanity's potential. The established civilizations had assumed that a species could only thrive on or around a single world, or perhaps in several scattered colonies. They hadn't anticipated that humans would build an entire civilization distributed across thousands of worlds and habitats, all connected by networks that allowed for constant communication and cultural exchange. A tall ambassador, speaking to a human consensus council session, expressed what many were beginning to understand. You have become something new. Not just a refugee species seeking new homes, but a civilization of the stars themselves. The galaxy will never be the same. 100 years into the Exodus, the human civilization faced a crisis that brought all the underlying tensions of their distributed existence to the surface. A disease, later identified as the Kashan Plague, named after the system where it was first detected, began spreading across human settlements. It was a pathogen that had jumped from the ruins of an ancient, extinct civilization to human colonists on the world of Kashan Prime. The disease was fast-moving, lethal in most cases, and initially appeared to resist all treatment. Within 6 months, it had infected 17 human settlements. Within a year, it had spread to over 300 communities across 40 star systems. The death toll was approaching 3 million people. The crisis exposed problems in the distributed civilization model that had been latent for decades. Different settlements had different medical protocols. Some had adequate quarantine facilities. Others didn't. Some communities hoarded medical supplies. Others shared them reluctantly. The absence of a central coordinating authority meant that the response to the plague was fragmented and often conflicting. Dr. Sarah Chen III, great-granddaughter of the original Sarah Chen who'd initiated the Exodus, was a medical researcher working at the New Renaissance Space City when she received the news about the plague's spread. She immediately reached out to her counterparts across human space, proposing a coordinated research effort. But coordinating across 1,000 different autonomous communities was complicated. Some settlements refused to share patient data for privacy reasons. Some were suspicious that a cure developed by one community would be withheld or monopolized by others. A few of the most isolated deep space explorer communities wanted to implement total quarantine, cutting themselves off from all communication and trade until the plague had run its course, which would mean they'd be cut off indefinitely. The consensus network, which had been so effective at building unity around abstract issues like cultural preservation and territorial expansion, proved inadequate for handling the immediate emergency of the plague. Too many voices, too many different perspectives, too many delays in reaching decisions while people were dying. Sarah made a controversial decision. She invoked Emergency Protocol 7, a provision in the Distributed Civilization's founding documents that allowed for temporary centralized decision-making in situations where the survival of the entire civilization was at immediate risk. The emergency protocol hadn't been used in 50 years. Its invocation caused immediate backlash from communities that saw it as a threat to their autonomy. Several settlements declared that they wouldn't comply with centralized directives. There were accusations that Sarah was trying to create a dictatorship, that the emergency was being exaggerated to justify consolidation of power. But Sarah pushed forward anyway. She established the Emergency Medical Council, drew the best researchers and medical practitioners from every human settlement, and focused them entirely on developing a cure or a treatment for the Kashan Plague. The challenge was that the plague was unlike any disease humanity had encountered. It was based on biochemistry that had evolved on an alien world, infecting human biology in ways that didn't follow patterns that human medicine was equipped to address. Standard antibiotics were useless. Standard viral treatments had no effect. The disease seemed to reprogram human cellular biology at a fundamental level, turning the body's own systems against itself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A researcher named Dr. James Okoro, originally from East Africa and now working on the world of New Lagos, combined human medical knowledge with insights he'd learned from studying tall biology during the interspecies collaboration programs. He proposed a treatment that used modified tall enzymes to interfere with the plague's cellular reprogramming mechanism. It worked. Not perfectly. About 70% of infected patients survived the treatment, but it was far better than the 0% survival rate that the plague had previously achieved. The treatment was immediately shared across all human settlements, free and unrestricted. Sarah made the decision to distribute the cure even before it had been fully tested on large populations, reasoning that a 70% survival rate was better than the 100% death rate that continued untreated plague produced. Within 2 years, the Kashan plague was contained and eventually eradicated. The total death toll reached 7 million people, a devastating loss, but not the extinction event that many had feared. In the aftermath of the crisis, something unexpected happened. Rather than resenting Sarah for her use of Emergency Protocol 7, most of humanity's settlements recognized that it had been necessary. More importantly, the crisis had revealed the deep interconnection of human civilization. Settlements that had been isolated and self-sufficient suddenly understood that they depended on others for survival. Researchers from different worlds had collaborated in ways that would have been impossible during peacetime. Communities that had been suspicious of each other had learned to trust. When the emergency powers were dissolved and the consensus network was restored to its normal function, it came back stronger. The temporary centralization had actually reinforced people's commitment to distributed decision-making. They understood viscerally what they were protecting by maintaining autonomy. The right to have diverse approaches, diverse voices, diverse perspectives contributing to human civilization. But the plague also revealed another reality that couldn't be ignored. The human civilization was vulnerable to threats it couldn't anticipate. Undiscovered pathogens in ancient ruins. Environmental hazards on unexplored worlds. Technology that looked safe but harbored deadly consequences. The larger humanity spread, the more it encountered the unknown, the more dangers lurked in the vast darkness of space. A new initiative emerged from the Consensus Network, the Institute for Existential Risk. It was dedicated to identifying, analyzing, and preparing for the kinds of challenges that could threaten the entire human civilization. It maintained networks of scientists across every human world and habitat. It conducted ongoing research into potential dangers. And it worked closely with allies like the Tal to share knowledge about threats that could affect spacefaring civilizations. 150 years after the initial launch of the Exodus, something happened that nobody had predicted. Earth was recovering. Michael Torres, the scientist who'd remained behind to work on planetary restoration, had passed away peacefully at the age of 135. But the work he'd begun continued, carried forward by thousands of others who'd made the same choice he had, to remain on Earth and work to heal their home world. The reforestation projects had succeeded beyond anyone's optimistic expectations. The carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, while still elevated, were beginning to decline as vast forests spread across previously barren landscapes. The oceans, given 2 centuries of respite from industrial fishing and pollution, were showing signs of biological recovery. Extinct species were being reconstructed from genetic archives and carefully reintroduced into restored ecosystems. Earth would never be what it had been before human industrial civilization. The climate had shifted permanently. The biodiversity was permanently altered. But it was becoming something new, a world shaped by human intention and care, rather than human carelessness and exploitation. And surprisingly, people were coming back. Not in the billions who had left, but in substantial numbers. Humans who'd been born in space and wanted to experience planetary living. Researchers who wanted to study the mechanisms of ecological restoration. Artists and philosophers attracted to the idea of living on a world being intentionally healed rather than fought against. The population of Earth stabilized at around 500 million people, roughly the size of Earth's population in the year 1800. It was a much smaller human presence than the planet had once supported, but it was a sustainable presence, one that allowed for the continuation of technological civilization while maintaining ecological balance. The remaining humans on Earth developed a unique cultural identity. They were the keepers, the ones who remained behind while their species spread to the stars. They maintained archives of human history going back to the very beginning. They preserved Earth's cultural heritage. They conducted scientific research on the unique phenomenon of an entire planet being intentionally managed for human habitation and ecological balance. But perhaps the most important work they did was maintaining Earth as a symbol. For every human scattered across thousands of worlds throughout the galaxy, Earth remained home in a spiritual sense. It was the place from which all of humanity had originated. And knowing that Earth was healing gave the scattered children of that world a sense of connection to something ancient and real and true. Meanwhile, the human civilization in space continued to expand, evolve, and change. The Tall had become true partners in the human project, their civilization increasingly integrated with human civilization. Humans and Tall worked alongside each other on space cities. They formed families and raised children together. They created art and music that blended the distinct aesthetic traditions of both species. In some regions of space, it became nearly impossible to tell a settlement that was primarily human from one that was primarily Tall. They had become too intermingled. Other species had joined the expanding network of civilization that humanity and the Tall had built. The Krell, initially allies only for strategic purposes, had become cultural partners, their deep mathematical insights revolutionizing human understanding of physics and computing. The Vermis, the cybernetic biological hybrids, had created whole new forms of consciousness that enhanced human technology and allowed for novel approaches to problem-solving. The Silent Council, observing all of this, realized that the galactic order they had maintained for millions of years was fundamentally changing. The quarantine that they'd tried to impose on humanity hadn't prevented human expansion, it had accelerated it. The restrictions they'd placed had pushed humanity toward innovation and alliance building. The young species that they'd tried to constrain had become a force that was reshaping galactic civilization. A peace summit was convened. For the first time in recorded history, the ancient powers that made up the Silent Council sat down at negotiating tables with representatives of humanity, the Tall, the Krell, and the Vermis. The negotiations lasted for 3 years. The treaty that emerged was transformative. The quarantine zone was officially dissolved. Human civilization was granted full status within the galactic community. The distributed civilization model was recognized as a valid form of governance, equal in status to the centralized imperial structures of some of the older species. Rights of settlement, trade, research, and cultural exchange were guaranteed. And most significantly, a new galactic council was established that included representatives from both ancient and young civilizations, with equal voting power. Humanity had become an equal participant in galactic civilization. Not the most powerful, that distinction still belonged to the oldest species. Not the largest, the Zen hive mind collective encompassed more individuals than all of humanity combined. But equal, recognized, legitimate. 200 years after the launch of the first ship, the age of active exodus came to an end. The final ship, designated ship number 1,500,000 in the end, was a massive vessel carrying not refugees fleeing a dying world, but explorers and scientists heading toward the mysterious regions of the galaxy that still remained largely unexplored by humanity. Its captain was a third-generation spaceborne human who'd been trained by humans who'd never touched Earth. The original purpose of the Exodus had been achieved many times over. Earth was no longer dying. It was being healed. The human species was no longer concentrated on a single world, vulnerable to extinction by a single event. Humanity was distributed across thousands of worlds and habitats, integrated into galactic civilization, contributing to the broader community of spacefaring species. The resources that had been dedicated to the Exodus, the massive space infrastructure, the asteroid mining operations, the orbital factories, were now retasked toward new purposes. Some were converted into deep space exploration vehicles. Some became trading posts and cultural exchange centers. Some were dedicated to pure scientific research, and some were transformed into monuments and museums, preserving the memory of the great exodus that had saved humanity from extinction. Sarah Chen IV, great-great-granddaughter of the Sarah Chen who'd initiated the exodus, visited Earth for the first time in her life at the age of 40. She'd been born in the new Renaissance space city, trained as a cultural historian, and had spent her career documenting the history of human diaspora. Coming to Earth meant stepping into the past, literally walking on the world where her species had originated. She stood on what had once been a coastal city, now carefully managed as a combination city and nature preserve. The forests that had grown over the ruins of old buildings created a strange landscape, nature reclaiming what it had lost. But humans lived here too, walking among the ancient structures and the new growth, maintaining the balance. An old woman named Maya approached Sarah as she stood contemplating the view. Maya was 212 years old, one of the longest-lived humans, kept alive by medical technology that the humans had developed through their journey through the cosmos. "First time on Earth?" Maya asked gently. Sarah nodded. "My ancestors left here 200 years ago. I've spent my whole life in space." "Earth feels different when you arrive after living elsewhere," Maya said. "I left Earth myself, as a young woman. I spent 100 years out in space. When I came back, I found that Earth had become a place of memory for me. Not home exactly, but a place that held the memory of home." "Do you regret leaving?" Sarah asked. Maya smiled. "Not for a moment. The Exodus saved us. And what we became, scattered across the stars, connected by networks, building new forms of civilization, that's worth more than staying in one place would have been. But I'm glad to come home sometimes. I'm glad the home is still here." Sarah spent a month on Earth. She visited the archives where the history of humanity's entire evolution was preserved. She walked in the restored forests where animals that had nearly gone extinct were thriving again. She met with the keepers, the humans who'd chosen to remain behind, and interviewed them about their perspective on the Exodus and the history that had followed. She visited the Museum of the Exodus, a structure built in part from preserved sections of some of the original colony ships. Inside, the entire history of the Great Journey was documented. The desperation of the early days, the technological breakthroughs, the first encounters with alien civilizations, the crisis of the Cashin Plague, the negotiations with the Silent Council, the eventual establishment of equality in galactic affairs. Most importantly, there was a memorial to the billions of humans who had died on Earth before the Exodus began. The people killed by the climate collapse and resource wars and the famines that had preceded the successful launch of the million ships. Their names, individually where possible and collectively where individual records hadn't been preserved, were inscribed in vast memorial chambers. Standing in those chambers, Sarah understood something that no amount of historical study had quite conveyed to her. The Exodus hadn't been just an engineering project or a logical response to a crisis. It had been an act of desperate love. Humanity had reached the brink of extinction and had chosen, collectively, to survive. Yes, some had stayed behind, some had chosen other paths. But the fundamental choice, repeated billions of times by billions of individuals, had been to continue, to persist, to become something new rather than disappear into history. When Sarah returned to space, she carried Earth with her in a way she hadn't before. She understood now, truly understood, why even humans born generations after the Exodus still spoke of Earth with reverence. It was the mother world, the place of origin, the home from which all of humanity's vast present existence had sprung. The 200-year anniversary of the Exodus was commemorated throughout human civilization with festivals, ceremonies, and gatherings. In the space cities, humans and allied species celebrated together. On planetary colonies, communities gathered to remember their shared history. On Earth, millions of people, both native Earthers and visitors from the stars, gathered in locations that had been significant during the Exodus's preparation. But the most profound celebration occurred in what was now called the Archive of Diaspora. This massive facility, established in orbit around Earth, contained the complete record of human civilization's journey through space. It documented every settlement, every innovation, every cultural development, every challenge overcome. It preserved not just factual data, but stories, the personal narratives of billions of people who'd been part of the Exodus. An opening ceremony was held that was broadcast across every human settlement and to allied species throughout the galaxy. Speakers represented the diversity of human civilization, planetary settlers and space dwellers, the descendants of the original Earth population and the space-borne generations, scientists and artists and farmers and engineers. The final speaker was a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez II, great-granddaughter of the original Elena Vasquez who'd first understood that the Silent Council was motivated by fear. She was ancient, sustained only by the most advanced medical technology, and this would likely be one of her last public appearances. 200 years ago, she said, her voice transmitted across the vast distances of space, our species made a choice. We could have given up. We could have resigned ourselves to extinction. We could have spent our final generations in despair, watching our world die beneath us. Instead, we chose hope. We chose effort. We chose each other. She paused, looking out at the vast assembly of humanity and their allies. We built 1,000,000 ships. We defied galactic logistics and the skepticism of established powers. We created a civilization distributed across thousands of worlds, united not by force but by choice, by shared history, by our commitment to each other's survival and flourishing. And we did this not just for ourselves, not just for the humans who lived 200 years ago. We did it for the children born in space who'd never see Earth. We did it for the generations yet to come. We did it because to be human is to reach beyond what seems possible, to imagine futures that don't exist yet, and to work together to create them. Today, as we commemorate the Exodus, let us remember not just what we overcame, but what we became. We are no longer a single-planet species fearing extinction. We are children of 1,000 worlds, partners in a galactic community, builders of something genuinely new in the universe. And Earth, our home world, is healing, not to return to what it was. That world is gone forever. But to become something new, something we're creating deliberately, with purpose and care. Earth, too, is part of the diaspora, part of the great human story now. We are the species that couldn't be contained. We are humanity distributed across the stars. And our story is only beginning. The speech ended to cascades of applause and celebration from trillions of people across the galaxy. In the archive of diaspora, a new entry was being created, recording this moment, this gathering, this affirmation of humanity's collective survival and flourishing. Sarah Chen watched the celebration from the orbital platform where she stood with her family, humans born on 3 different worlds and one person who'd been born on a space city that had drifted through the void for 300 years. They held each other as they watched the vast commemoration of humanity's journey. In that moment, Sarah felt the deep truth that had driven the entire Exodus, the refusal to accept death, the insistence on life, the commitment to each other that had allowed a desperate species facing extinction to transform themselves into something that now thrived across the cosmos. The great filter had been crossed, not by force of arms or technological dominance, but by stubborn human persistence, by cooperation, by love, and by the fundamental choice to continue. Humanity had arrived, and wherever the future took them, to distant stars yet unexplored, to forms of civilization yet unimagined, to challenges and wonders beyond what they could presently conceive, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else. The Exodus was over. The real journey was just beginning.
The end.